Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here. Uh, we're getting started right on time. It's 12 o'clock. We're going to be in for a treat today because the last time Dr. Puckett was here, we had one of the best presentations on the subject that we ever had. Today will be no exception. As you know, he is history professor at Troy State University, and he's chair of the Holocaust Commission, and for the past few years he's been working within the Jewish program. He's got an earned PhD from Mississippi State, and the book that we do have one in copy, but he didn't. We didn't have any to sell today, but we can certainly take care of that for you if you check with the people out at the desk if you're interested. He's written extensively on the Jewish living in the South, but especially Alabama. His work has appeared in all sorts of publications on the Holocaust, genocide studies, Alabama heritage, and the Southern Jewish histories. We're delighted to have Dan and Dr. Puckett. We'll turn the program over to you and just show them what a wonderful piece that you did with that textbook and whatever else you want to put with it. And if you want to answer questions at the end, please do. If you don't want to answer them, tell them no. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good, good. I'm so glad to be back. Thank you, Dr. Ted. Sure, Dr. Spears, thank you so much for being here. This is, I think, my third time. I think it's been about 10 years since I was here last, and that's way too long. I can't rave enough about the type of program that the Comer Library puts on. And I was telling Dr. Spears that this is, I think, the most well-attended lunch program that I've ever been a part of in the state. And that's, I think, a testament to the library, to the staff, to Dr. Spears, and of course to all of you who attend these sort of things. And I am so thrilled to be here again. And what I want to do today is to talk about Alabama's Jewish community and how it navigated the events of the 30s, and especially in World War II. How did it deal with the rise of Nazi Germany, the persecution of German Jews, many of whom Jews here in Alabama had relatives back in Europe at the time. So how did they navigate that? And what specifically did they do during the war, both on the home front and the Jewish soldiers that were fighting in Europe? So a lot to cover and 45 minutes to do it. So I hope you will just bear with me. As I was telling them, the real trick is going to be keeping things to 45 minutes here. And by the way, he said about my book, which is titled In the Shadow of Hitler, Alabama's Jews, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. You can find that on Amazon. Or you can order it from them. But either way, I'm just delighted to present what I've found, what I've written about, and what I'm currently writing more about, which is Alabama's responses to the Holocaust. Let me start, and this is kind of nice because I have this on my head. I can actually walk around a little bit, which I do in the classroom. So I hope you'll bear with me if I don't just stay right back up here. Before we start, let me say something about Alabama's Jewish community. In fact, it was settled certainly in the late 18th century, certainly by the 19th century. Many Central European Jews, mostly from what would become Germany, settled. By 1881. There is an influx of Jews from Eastern Europe, By the early 20th century, more from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Sephardic community. And by the 1930s, really where we start our story here, you have generations who have been here for decades, some for maybe over a century, and others who had just arrived. There is a book, a very important book, well-read book by a man named Eli Evans, and he wrote about Southern Jews. It was called The Provincials, and that's how he described Southern Jews, as the provincials. He said they were the provincials, the Jews of the periphery, that is not at the center of things. Prior to the Civil War, the bulk of Jews in the United States resided in the South. After the 1880s, of course, it's going to be in the Northeast, New York. In fact, most people by the 20th century and even today look at New York, and the New York Jewish experience is, or as the American Jewish experience, and that's far from the case. And this is what Eli Evans was trying to get across, that the Jews in the South, including those in Alabama, were simply out there, on the periphery, not at the center of things. And what I found with my research, and what I certainly argue, is that that's not the case at all. That they are mixed up in things that are going on. Now, certainly Alabama didn't have the culture and opportunities and amenities that the Northeast did, New York did, but the experiences of Alabama's Jews and Southern Jews as a whole mirrored experiences of Jews across the country. In fact, mirrored the experiences of Jews living in the Midwest and the West, and even those outside the huge urban areas in the Northeast. They're fully aware of what's going on. All right, they know exactly who Hitler was, who the Nazis were, what they were doing, what their plans were, their anti-Semitic policies, their ideology. They belonged to national organizations. In fact, there were some who even led these national organizations. So they, in fact, I would argue they really were cosmopolitan, not provincial. So they knew what was happening. And even if we look at the Alabama public, the non-Jewish public, they too knew what was going on. And if you've read any of the newspapers, and this is before television, that any of the newspapers were covering international events. So when you hear stories that, well, we didn't know what was happening in Europe. Yes, you did. Well, not you, but yes, they did. They were very aware of events happening in Europe because it was reported on a daily basis. All you had to do was read, and Alabamians read. In fact, I've examined just about every Alabama newspaper from 1933 to 1946. This is before they were on the database. This is before you, and I tell my students, they don't realize how easy research is. How many of you have used microfilm before? And now my students just get online and they'll type in a keyword and it pops up. But when you sit and you look through roll after roll after roll after, and I could go on, it is incredibly difficult. But what I found are the newspapers. I'm thinking the old Montgomery Advertiser, for instance, or the old Birmingham News. Had more news on the front page than the entire Montgomery Advertiser has now. And there's not even a Birmingham News. So they knew what was happening here. So in this case, at least for the Jewish community, they were involved. They knew what was happening. The question is what to do about it. Now, by this point in time, Alabama's Jewish community was deeply divided, religiously, culturally, socially. You have the Central European Jews who were generally of the Reformed tradition. You have the more recently arrived Eastern European Jews who were Orthodox or had just moved to conservative persuasion. And then down in Mobile, you have a Sephardic community. So there's deep divides here within the Jewish community. Divisions of wealth and social class and things of this nature. But what was going on in Europe began to change this, because in 1933, as the Nazis began to persecute German Jews, what you start to see are Jews in Alabama, and this is the case of Jewish communities across the United States, began to coalesce and come together to support each other, or to try to aid European Jews, German Jews here. They're going to lobby state officials, local officials, even their national representatives to do something, to raise a protest. The city council in Birmingham, the city council in Mobile, all passed resolutions condemning the treatment of German Jews. I think governor in 33, it was Benjamin Miller, sent a letter condemning Hitler and calling for the Nazis to ease up on their treatment of the Jews. And a lot of this was done through Jewish lobbying of their representatives. But the thing is, no matter how well they organized, and they were organized, the most they could do was to save a handful. Now, there is a sentiment that American Jews didn't do enough to protest, to help, or to aid the persecuted European Jews during the 30s and during World War II. And what I found, if you look at the local, at the state level, now national organizations, I think that's fair game. But if you look at local Jewish communities, local organizations, or even statewide organizations, they're doing everything they can, often putting aside their differences to try to make a difference. And so I'm not sure that criticism that they didn't do enough holds up. They work with other national organizations when the refugee crisis reached its high point in 1938, that many wanted to flee Germany, but there was nowhere to go. Some were able to get into the United States, but then what? Well, there were organizations, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, HIAS, was one of those. The National Refugee Service, the NRS, was another. And they would contact local communities, in fact, throughout Alabama, throughout the United States, to help resettle many of these refugees who did arrive. Now, let me just say that across the board, the American public and even the Alabama public was against immigration. Now, remember, this is in the midst of Depression, right? These immigrants, these refugees would compete for American jobs. By 1940, you're worried about enemy espionage, these sorts of things. But largely, it was an economic competition that many of these refugees would provide that they were against. The public disliked the Nazis tremendously. They disliked their treatment of the Jews. They disliked their treatment of other minorities. They sympathized with the plight of German Jews. There was a national opinion poll in 1938. This was just after Kristallnacht, which we're coming up on the anniversary of pretty soon. But I think it was 90%, close to 90% of the American public condemned the Nazis for their persecution of the Jews. But when the question was asked, would you welcome these refugees into the United States and open the doors, 75% said no. So they could sympathize, but they're not wanting refugees here. But those who did get in, and again, there were quotas as far as who could come in, and all this goes back to the 1920s, 1924 National Origins Act. But those who did come in, what happens? And so the thought was they would resettle throughout the United States. And this is when a number of family members and others came to Alabama. In fact, the Alabama Holocaust Education Center in Birmingham actually has a number of stories and oral histories of many of those who made their way out of Nazi Germany and did come in the 1930s. Fascinating to hear their stories. So what they're doing is trying to work together to aid that. Now, they're not going to be able to sway immigration policy, even though we have very influential representatives in Washington. You know, what's an interesting thing, we are in a very deep red state. I don't think that's any surprise. But did you know in the 1930s, we had one of the most liberal congressional contingents in the nation? New Deal Democrats, Senator Lister Hill, Sparkman, Bankhead, and many of the representatives very much tried to work here. Now, they're still conservative, but liberal in a New Deal sense, but very influential with the Roosevelt administration. And even they couldn't sway immigration policy. Now, many would work for their constituents and help individual family members get out. You see this with Lister Hill, you see this with John Sparkman a little bit later, you see this with Carter Manasco, you see this with a number of others who are against opening doors, but they're willing to work for their constituents to get individual family members in. And a lot of this was due to Jewish lobbying their representatives. Now, during the war, if we move ahead, we start to see national defense pick up in 1940. Now, we don't get into the war until December 7th of 41, but by 1940, the winds of war are in the air, and so national defense begins to pick up. Conscription, though there's not a draft yet, they do begin the selective service, and communities begin to organize themselves. And by the time war does break out, you're going to start to see these communities throughout Alabama begin to work together, despite their differences. We'll get off this page here. There we go. It's just an image here of the state. And, you know, the Birmingham, the largest city, Montgomery, Mobile, these are the central cities in which the Jewish population lived. Now, during World War II, the Department of War began to buy up land out in the country and establish military bases. Now, some had been established in World War I, some, such as, I don't think there is a laser pointer. I told him I didn't need a laser pointer, and now I need a laser pointer. Here we go. Look at this. Thank you. My clicker in my classroom has one, so I'm just used to doing this. Look at that. Up in Anniston, for instance, right there, Fort McClellan was one of the central bases. Just to the south here, you see Ozark, Enterprise, Dothan, the triangular camp. I'm trying to remember the exact name, but they roughly name it Camp Rucker. But I can't remember the official name, something triangular regiment. But yes, it's Camp Rucker. It's basically Fort Rucker. It wasn't a fort in World War II. That's after World War II becomes Fort Rucker. And then Novacell, and now back to Rucker. But right down here, these are the two major training centers. And Dothan, Enterprise, Ozark has small Jewish communities. Anniston has a small Jewish community. Now, you'll have a base around Selma, you'll have one around Gadsden, up around here. There's smaller ones all over, generally where smaller Jewish communities reside. Now, McClellan and Rucker started to see an influx of tens of thousands of soldiers. In fact, many coming from the Northeast, where the bulk of American Jews reside. And so there were a lot of northern Jewish soldiers, inductees, that actually came down. Now, y'all are familiar with the USO, right? United Service Organizations. In 1941, Roosevelt creates the USO out of 6 organizations: the YMCA, YWCA, Salvation Army, National Catholic Community Service, the National Travelers Aid, and it's the National Jewish Welfare Board is the other, designed to, in essence, help soldiers who were enlisted to provide entertainment, support, whether it's spiritual support or what have you. Now, the Jewish Welfare Board began actually in 1915 in World War I. And by this point in time, many local Jewish welfare boards began to organize themselves. In fact, let me dealing with 2 different things. Here's one. And the Standard Club in Montgomery was a Jewish social club, but it was for the Reform congregation, not the Orthodox or Sephardic congregation. They had their own. Like I said, still deep divisions. The Reform, the German Jews in the Reform tradition generally had arrived much earlier. They had assimilated to a greater degree. They were wealthier and generally more successful than the Orthodox or Sephardic communities. And to show that even though they're coming together, it's still very divided. The Standard Club, the Jewish community, in fact, the one thing that soldiers, anybody in there here ever served? If you've been to anything like that, one of the things that basically if you're on furlough or if you're somewhere else, it's nice to have girls around, okay? Dances were just a huge deal. In Montgomery, many of the girls at Temple Beth Or, which was the Reformed congregation, organized their own social organization to entertain the officers that were stationed at Maxwell, Gunter, and Taylor Fields. Now, the Orthodox girls or Sephardic girls had their own organizations and entertained the enlisted men. So you can still see some of that class differences. So dance is always popular. If we go back, this is the Anniston USO here. This is actually from World War II. And each city had their own USO central basically central building. The Jewish Welfare Board actually ran and administered this one. But everyone came to the USO facilities. Now, each one would have their own smaller facility devoted to Jewish soldiers or Christian soldiers or Catholic soldiers, you name it. Now, it's also segregated, so this is white only, okay? Even though there was a black YMCA and so forth, they have their own USO organizations. But in Anniston, for instance, the Jewish community is not large enough, and it's just a reform community. They're not large enough to have enough girls to entertain all the soldiers, to dance with all the soldiers. So they would bus in Jewish girls from Birmingham. And the funny story is, years ago when I was doing some research out at the Jewish Community Center there in Birmingham, down in the basement looking at records, and I was talking to somebody, I actually ran into a woman. She had to be in her 80s, and she says, "Oh, I was a Victory girl. I used to go over to Anniston all the time and dance." And so that was really interesting. So dances there. And by the way, in Dothan, for instance, at Camp Rucker, again, not a large Jewish community. It's heavily evangelical. And if you grew up in a Baptist church like me, you didn't dance. They could not hold dances, which made the USO incredibly unpopular in Dothan. And even the Jewish Welfare Board didn't do dances. They're not Christians, so what did it matter? But they didn't want to upset the Christian community by holding dances. So what did they do? Now, this isn't from Dothan, but they did things like this. Watermelon cuttings. And you can see the images here. This is actually from a scrapbook from the rabbi at Temple Beth Or. And he had taken these pictures. Now, this is Montgomery, but they do this all over. They do this in Anniston. They'll do this in Selma. They'll do this in Jasper, in Gadsden, and down at Rucker in Dothan as well. They couldn't dance, but they could eat watermelon. But one of the points I want to make here is the Jewish community had to come together, had to organize, had to work together to put aside their differences to address the threat to European Jews, to German Jews. All right. Now, during the war, especially in the small towns, because there were so few, and even in Birmingham, a larger city, there's an influx of tens of thousands of soldiers coming in, especially on the weekends. Virtually every member of the Jewish community had to do something in order to make this a success. So this did a lot to mitigate much of the differences and force them to work together. So you start to see the communities changing. This is an image of a service in Montgomery. And by the way, photographs from this era are few and far between. I was lucky to stumble across this scrapbook up in Cincinnati. And this shows a service at Temple Beth Or. Now, the vast majority of the soldiers you see, and probably even the soldier carrying the Torah there, were Northern Jews, most likely Orthodox, who had never set foot in a Reformed temple. Yet, there's a lot of crossover here. In fact, there's a lot of challenges that many of these Orthodox soldiers had to deal with when coming south or in the Midwest, basically to rural areas. One of those things is their diet. It's virtually impossible to keep kosher. In fact, there was a term for it that again, chipped beef, ham, pork chops, those things were in abundance and served by the mess halls across the board. And so many Jewish soldiers simply took it as you're having to eat ham for Uncle Sam. You just have to make that you have to just choke it down, and that was okay. So very rarely could you attempt to keep kosher. But this is the first time that they were probably in a Reform temple. And the Reform tradition dominates the American South. So it's a very different religious experience for many of those coming south. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the soldiers in a minute. When, after the war, when it's all done, what's going to happen, you don't have refuge. After 1939 and the war begins in Europe, there are no more refugees trying to get in because Hitler is not letting anyone out. But after the war, they're not going to be called refugees, they're going to be called survivors or displaced persons. And and many of the displaced persons would remain in what we call DP camps, 1, 2, 3, sometimes up to 5 years. They couldn't go back home because of still rampant anti-Semitism, but much of their communities had been destroyed in the war. Many did come to the United States. Many actually left for British-controlled Palestine or, after 1948, Israel. At this point, you don't have refugees, you have survivors coming, and Alabama's community joined together again to assume responsibility for settling these DPs, these displaced persons who were coming to the United States. Now, they offer a different challenge than simply the refugees who had come in because they had so much trauma that they had went through. In fact, there were a number who had conditions, certainly mental health challenges that many of these local small communities simply couldn't handle. So they present their own challenges, but again, what you see is a community that is coming together to work with this. The one thing, and I do want to mention this before I jump into some of the experiences of the soldiers on the front lines, the issue or the topic of Zionism, that, should there be a Jewish state established in British-controlled Palestine? Now, 1917, the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration promising a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And so throughout the 1930s, especially when the persecutions began to ramp up, there is increasing disagreements between the Jewish community over should there be a Jewish state. Many of the Orthodox and Sephardic Jews firmly believed that there should. In fact, Zionism was much more rooted in the Orthodox and Sephardic communities than in the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition, in essence, emphasized assimilation into society as a way of advancement. And so many of the most outspoken anti-Zionists were actually Reformed Jews. And the most ardent Zionists were Orthodox. This also plays into that cleavage. But the one thing is here we go. And this is a cartoon from the Birmingham Age Herald. Many of you might remember the Post Herald. This was prior to that. In October of 1942, the State Department confirmed that the Nazis were attempting to, in essence, to exterminate the Jews, what we call the final solution. It's this that convinces many of the Reformed Jews that a Jewish state is absolutely necessary for the preservation of, in essence, Jewish society, Jewish culture, Jewish life. Now, this is a cartoon just right after the acknowledgement by the State Department. Now, the Jews aren't in this, but crimes against humanity. And this is what was confirmed. 1 year later, in fact, it's not even a year later, it's probably about 7 months later, in June of 1943, thanks to the lobbying of many of these Jewish organizations, Alabama becomes the first state in the Union to pass a joint resolution in the legislature calling for a Jewish state to be established in Palestine, specifically because of the Holocaust. Despite all of our racial history here, we were at the forefront of calling for a Jewish state. There were 12 in total. We were the first. And you have both Reform, Orthodox, and Sephardic doing this. And at that point in time, there were no Jewish legislators. So these are all Christian legislators who are doing this. And what I'd say about that is, today, Israel and the Holocaust are very central to Jews and to Jewish memory, and really a central place within the American Jewish communities themselves. What's interesting is even in the Reformed temples, you can go, and I've shown you a lot from Temple Beth Or in Montgomery. In Temple Beth Or in the 1930s, its rabbi was an ardent anti-Zionist, was totally against the idea of a Jewish state. But if you go to Temple Beth Or now, just about any Jewish temple, synagogue, you're going to see programs on Israel. You're going to see maybe an Israeli flag. So times have certainly changed, and the Holocaust did that. The war in the Holocaust did that. Now, let me touch on some soldiers here. I've got a little bit of time left, and I don't want to give them, I don't want to shortchange their stories here. And I'm going to have to, because there's just too many stories. But let me give you some statistics, if you don't mind. During World War II, the Jewish population in the United States numbered roughly around 5 million. That's just under 4% of the population. Now, there's a lot less, maybe 215,000 living in the South. In Alabama, we had just 12,000 Jews. And that's less than 1% of the population here. Now, out of this whole population, there were about 550,000 Jews that served in World War II. Again, about 4.3% of all the soldiers in the armed services, but that equals 11 to 12% of Jews served in the military. One of the great anti-Semitic tropes of the period is that Jews were avoiding military service, that they were using their positions, their influence, their privilege to avoid service because of numerous issues. And what statistics show us is that they served in numbers equal to their population. In fact, the total number of Jewish casualties was just under 40,000. And they're serving in dangerous positions here. So, those anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews wanting to avoid any sort of dangerous service, totally erroneous, totally erroneous. So they serve in numbers proportionate to their population, infantry, other hazardous fields, and very much was at the forefront of that. Most of those, and I spent probably 2.5 years traveling around the state, interviewing World War II veterans, Jewish World War II veterans, Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, Opelika, over to Selma. Again, those who, they were elderly by that point in time. And they would tell stories about their service, often for the first time. I don't know how many times, and I've heard this from other veterans as well. This is the first time I've talked about it. But once they start talking, it unleashes a torrent that they can't stop, and you just have to sit there, and it's so powerful. listening to their stories, but for American Jews. And certainly those Jewish veterans, I think the war, especially the war in Europe, the war against Nazi Germany, had much greater meaning for them than for non-Jews. And I think you're going to have a handful who will actually come across Nazi atrocities firsthand that leave a lasting mark on that. You know, even the newspapers, the Birmingham News, the Montgomery Advertiser, the Mobile Register, you name it, they paint Germany as the central enemy, despite Pearl Harbor, despite the Japanese attacking us throughout the war. Germany is painted as the central enemy. So the public kind of viewed it that way as well. Let me give you an example here. Sam Kaiser, I interviewed years ago, and he probably had the grittiest war stories that I'd heard. But I'd ask him when he was growing up in the 30s what he remembered about it. He said, adults didn't talk around kids that much. I hoped we were going to defeat Hitler before he got over here and got some of us. I didn't have any deep thoughts at the age of 13 or 14. By the time I got to high school, we were thinking we were getting ready to go to war. We didn't like the Germans, period. I mean, all of us were united in the way we felt. It had nothing to do with religion, but the Jews felt it more acutely. And this seems to be a theme that runs through this. And you can see they knew by 42 of what was actually happening. Rabbi Milton Grafman of Birmingham, some of you may remember Milton Grafman. He served as rabbi from 1941. He actually came to Birmingham December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, and assumed the pulpit and retired. I think he officially retired in 75, but didn't stop his ministry until he passed in 95. And if you're around Birmingham and know any of the Jewish people in the community up there, especially in the Emmanuel community, they certainly would remember Grafman. But he began a newspaper called The Servicemen, trying to connect basically the soldiers with the home front. And again, these were shipped overseas. These were sent to soldiers. These were sent throughout the community. And he publishes letters from congregants who are overseas. And I mean, it's just, and some of the stories are in the letters. And by the time I found out who they were, they had long since passed. I never got to talk with them, but their stories are actually in The Servicemen. You know, and he talked about there was a man named Henry Burnbury who had escaped in the 1930s. He came the German Jewish Children's Aid. This helped German children get out. Their parents didn't come along. But he got to the United States and was resettled in Birmingham. And for a while, he toured the city talking about, and again, this is a teenager who's talking about this to the community and telling them what's going on in Germany. His parents die in Kristallnacht. So he doesn't have parents now. He eventually moves to Atlanta, but he joins the army when the war begins, becomes an American citizen, joins the army, and goes to fight the Nazis. And this is not uncommon for many of these refugees who come. But here he's talking about what it meant to them. And basically it's reinforcing their identity as Jews. and how much it meant to them. You have instances in which some are beginning to donate to the Federation or to Jewish causes for the first time. You have stories that, and again, these are in the servicemen, of them making their way through Germany towards the end of the war, 1945. They're not really seeing any sort of synagogue, but they're stopping and they're holding seders, they're holding services. In fact, they held one in Joseph Goebbels' hometown. They rebuilt the synagogue, or I say rebuilt, they repaired it enough to where they could hold a service in Goebbels' old hometown. So there was a conscious effort to maintain that identity and to emphasize that identity. There were some, I'm trying to wrap up, I know we're kind of running short, so I am conscious of time. Dick Loeb, he was with the 82nd Airborne. He was part of those who liberated Ludwigslust here at the Vöbeln concentration camp in 1945. And it was his unit that forced the German population to tour the camp, to witness what had been done in their name, and then to bury all the victims. And he carried that with him coming back. One of the things, and let me just, I've got about 10 more stories, and I could go on. I mean, they're so good. Let me just share one with you here before wrapping this up. And this is probably the most fun I've ever had in an interview. We were at Temple Bethel, the conservative synagogue in Birmingham, and I sat down with Norman Nyron, who was a World War II veteran. I sat down with Sidney Ziff, who was about 100 at that point, old enough in the 1930s to be an adult and basically know the people I'm writing about, and another older gentleman of the community, and I had my recorder, and we just started talking. And I think what you get from me mostly is some questions and then laughter, because the stories they were telling were just so great. Norman Nyron, for instance, was part of a bombing crew, and they flew missions over Germany towards the end of the war. And of course, they know what was going on. They knew all about this. And he was telling the story. He said, I just wanted to get back at them. I wanted to get back at Hitler so bad, but I didn't know what to do other than dropping by. I think that's kind of a lot. You're dropping bombs all over him. But he said, finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. He went to the back of the plane, and he got an empty artillery box. And as he said, he went a number 2 in it. He closed it up and wrote for Hitler and dropped it out. And I think that was the best story I've heard of any veteran dealing with that. So they felt it very consciously. When they come back, of course, they believe things are getting better, that anti-Semitism across the board began to recede after World War II. In fact, Leonard Dinnerstein, the great historian of American anti-Semitism, wrote that across the board. Because of the optimism after victory, the euphoria after victory, the opportunities that arose, that anti-Semitism across the board began to decline. This is where Alabama differed. How many of you, especially you, those older in the crowd, remember somebody named John Cromlin? Okay, you know what I'm talking about, who ran for every office that was available, ran for governor, ran for senator, ran for everything. He ran on an avowed anti-Semitic. In fact, one of the Jewish organizations that monitored anti-Semitism And this is in the 1960s, said that he's making Wallace look tame. Never won anything, but raised, and then again, the civil rights movement began, which led to an increase in anti-Semitism throughout the South. Elsewhere, it seemed to recede. In Alabama, because of certain instances, which is another story, it seemed to increase. But many came back with this optimism. Emil Hess, and I'll wrap up with Mr. Hess, who was in Birmingham. He was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy. He said the anti-Semitic attitudes would be mitigated once the war ended. Boys who have been through hell together aren't going to hate. When the servicemen come home, they won't go for anti-Semitism. They will have a healthy outlook on life. They're going to remember the friends who fought side by side with him without giving a thought to differences in creed. And so he thought all the experiences of war is going to alter the attitudes in the post-war world. In a lot of ways, it did. He went on to say the troublemakers, those who would sow discord between Christian and Jews, are the people who are sitting this war out or just talking about it. The boys who are doing the fighting have a different slant on things. Largely that's true, even though there are some contradictions there. Hess went on to live what he said. Does anybody know who Emil Hess was? If you know him, he didn't found it, but his family did run on to run the Parisian department store. And Donald, his son, has been a great help with a lot of this. So there's a lot here that is affecting the Alabama Jewish community, but by and large, what we see, especially with the veterans returning, the differences in the community begin to mend. Although they're still there, and especially talking to some older members of the community, they can say, well, it's this and this. I think a lot of younger members probably don't see those old cleavages, but it is nothing like it was prior. And so I think the great experience here is that, it brought the Jewish community closer. And this is not just an Alabama story. This is a story throughout the American South. But it also brought a new set of leaders, veterans, who would lead the Jewish community and lead basically the cities they lived in. It's not just leading the Jewish community. Many of these were leaders within the community at large. And I would argue, even though it's a different story, many of the black veterans who came back served as leaders of their community and often members of the civil rights movement. So the experiences of war did a lot to alter the Alabama Jewish community, which, for the most part, I think is in line with other communities. I don't think there's anything distinctly different than this. I think you're seeing trends that we are very much like others and in our response. Even though there are different stories, different circumstances, the trends seem to be very similar. The American Jewish experience is not just in New York. It's everywhere. And ours is different than that, but more similar to the smaller areas in the Midwest and the West than that, and just as valid as anywhere else. Let me stop here. I have run over just a little. I don't think they have come to give me a hook yet. So what I wanted to do, and if it's okay, I think we have time for questions and answers. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. I think we have a little bit of time. Yes, ma'am.
What is the population now of Jews in America and Alabama? Is it larger or?
Well, in Alabama, it's much smaller. I think it's somebody. So I don't know off the top of my head. I think we could probably Google that. But it's much smaller in Alabama. And this is a problem with Jewish communities in the South and the Midwest is many of the younger ones are leaving and not coming back. In fact, here in Alabama, they're going to Atlanta. They may be going to Nashville. They may be going to Charlotte, where there are vibrant Jewish communities, but also more economic opportunity. And so this is a challenge for the Jewish communities today. But it is smaller. But I think the population nationally is larger. But I don't have the numbers. Yes, sir.
Any anti-Semitism today primarily because of economic reasons?
Today, there's always anti-Semitic stereotypes that, Jews control finance, Jews control the banks, Jews control Hollywood, Jews control culture, all of those things. So it's still part of it. What we're seeing today is really a spike in anti-Semitism. You saw it spiking on the right. If y'all remember the Charlottesville marches and so forth, that's on the right. Now, you see as virulent an anti-Semitic reaction on the left today as well. And this is part and parcel due to the Israeli-Gaza war. So it's on both extremes now. In fact, after October 7th, it just exploded on the left, but it's still there on the right. I wouldn't say it's mostly economic, but you still hear these stereotypes. They're plentiful. I hope that answered your question. Yes, ma'am.
Merchants here in our county, and other people probably know, I know WWII. What are some of the Sokals? What are some of the other food? Yeah, Satterway.
And that's actually how many Jews got into the smaller towns. They started as peddlers and then settled down and opened stores and making connections all over. And so you mentioned the Sokals. Well, there are Sokals, and they're all connected. Bessemer, Birmingham, Anniston, they're all over the region. Yes, okay, there was a question here, and let me go here.
I was going to ask, after the war, when Europe got split into between free and communist,
Yes.
so if the Jewish survivors were, say, trapped in a communist country, how were they treated by the communists?
Initially, again, Stalin wasn't, especially the Jews in the Soviet Union, they were not favored. They didn't receive the same sort of persecutions they had under the Nazis, but certainly there was anti-Semitism. Now, the difference is Hitler wanted them out, but there was nowhere really for them to go. Stalin wouldn't let them out. Until what was it, the 70s, I think, when you had the wave of those being able to immigrate out of the Soviet Union. I know less about that. I can't really speak to that as much. But no, there was not that type of persecution, but there was tremendous anti-Semitism there, yes. But it's not really until the 70s until they're allowed to leave. Hitler wanted them gone, but there was really nowhere for them to go. By 39, it just shuts off. You had a question.
No, it's not a question. I've lived everything that you talked about today. My grandfather came from Germany in 1890, and we opened a store in Alexander City, Frozen's.
Okay.
Frohssin. He dropped one of the N's off that name to make it more American. In Germany, it was but I was confirmed at Temple Bethel.
Okay.
Dr. Blackschlager,
That was his,
when you said, I figured
that was Eugene Blackschlager was the rabbi. He was a charter member of the American Council for Judaism.
and good friends of my family as well.
Yeah. You must remember Leo Drum.
No.
Okay. He's one of the other, he had to be 100. He was an older member. Loved Blackschlager.
No, but
Yeah.
the picture you had of I'm awful with names now, but he was a good Loeb.
Oh, Dick. Yeah, Dick Loeb.
Was a good friend of my dad. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many connections between Mobile and Montgomery, intermarriages, between community from Mobile to Montgomery, Atlanta to Montgomery, and
And you're talking about young people not coming back.
right.
When I was growing up, there were about 15 Jewish, about 6 or 8 Jewish families, about 15, and then 3 of
Right.
us. It's my
Right.
wife, myself, and Barbara.
Yeah, it is. I am not Jewish, so I'm not in that. But most of my close friends are, and so I hear them talk about that sort of challenge for the Jewish community. So I'm not able to talk about that firsthand, other than what I have researched and what I know my friends are concerned about.
But you named the cities that they're migrating to.
Right. That is true. Any other questions? Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate this.
Thank you, Dr. Puckett. And I just want to say all the kind things that you said at the beginning about the well-attended programs at our library. I just think that your attendance here today, you may not realize it, but your attendance here today speaks not only to us at the library as we plan programs, but to Dr. Puckett as well, that our community values learning and education. And so thank you so much for just the testimony that your presence today makes for us. And I will say, when my granddaddy, a World War II veteran, used to talk about the Victory Girls, they were always the most upstanding girls in the community. I didn't know they were dance hall girls, so I learned something today.
One thing I will say is, no, they're not dance hall girls, and that's but every organization, the YMCA had their own groups, the Jewish Welfare Board had their own group, so everyone had their own, and they had Liberty Bells, Victory, all these different names, and so, but that was I think what soldiers, when they went on, they wanted to dance. That was the really the fun thing they wanted to do, and I guess Rucker wasn't the happening place that they would want to go.
Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you for the time you put into preparing this and for keeping these stories alive. It means a lot. So I want to say again, next week we have Dr. Marty Olaf with us, and he's got a unique story. And you think about when cars started traveling and people were taking road trips for the first time, where did they stop and spend the night? Where did they, where were the rest areas? Where were the hotels? And so it's the beginning of that, and it's called Bedding Down on the Beeline. So we hope you'll all come back next week. And Dr. Olaf is a good one, isn't he?
Will enjoy Marty. Oh, he's a storyteller. He's a storyteller.
And I also want to say thank you to our cookie boy back there in the back, Mr. Chris Kramer. Thank you to First Bank of Alabama and Mr. Chris Kramer. And thank you to the Coosa Valley Medical Center for those good cookies. Grab you some more on the way out. And back in the back, Dr. Ted Spears, Dr. Shirley Spears, the Comer Library Foundation. Thank y'all for all you do to help plan great programs. Thank you. We'll see you next week.